the IlLUMAnations, where we aim to showcase some of the healthcare and biotech industry's leading scientists, innovators, entrepreneurs, and investors. On this episode, we decided to turn inwards and showcase some of what our own team is doing. My name is Themasap Khan. I'm the co-founder and partner of Luma Group. Today, we're joined by Neel Madhukar, Chief Technology Officer of LABI, Luma Group's AI for biotech intelligence, our proprietary in-house AI model purpose-built for biotech investing. Neel has a PhD in computational biology and medicine. He's had a great career so far in the field as an entrepreneur and as an investor. Neel now uses his expertise on biotech and AI to lead LABI's core technology and product strategy. Welcome, Neel.
Thank you, Themasap. Excited to be here, both to Luma and on this podcast. It's been a crazy couple of months so far building LABI and working with you guys, and I'm really excited to keep it going.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. Neel, can you introduce LABI?
Of course. So LABI is our internal intelligence engine. Luma is what we call AI for biotech intelligence. The way we think about it is our effort and our attempt to take all of the learnings that are out there, all the data, and bring it into a cohesive system that we as a fund, our partners, our portfolio companies can use to make better decisions, find better companies, and ultimately help more patients. So the way I think about it is it's a three-part process. The first is data exists in the ether, let's bring it to us. Let's bring it to us in a way that we can look at it, we can see it, and it's structured in the way we want. So, the dream of LABI is when someone has a LABI terminal in front of them, in that LABI terminal is all the information they need to make their decision, right? Someone still's got to synthesize it from day one, but it's all there, similar to the Bloomberg terminal. On top of that, we want to build reasoning, right? We've talked a little bit about how once you have that data structured, what can you do with it, right? I think about this as, imagine an LLM trained just on your notes versus an LLM trained on the entire internet. It works a lot better because you give it more context. So what we want to do is, let's say we build this data network, can we then build new tools that allow it to reason on top and find insights that either we would have found but find them faster or we would have missed? Maybe a tool can automatically say, hey, if this target is hit and it causes liver toxicity, what does that mean for this industry? What does that mean for this company? What does that mean for the field? And then last is full integration into our investment processes, right? I think as these step one and step two grow, we start to think about LABI not just as a terminal or an insight generation tool, but as a way to rethink how we do decision making. Maybe it's actively finding things. Maybe it's identifying things we might have missed. It's almost like a companion in the room. I always kind of go back to tumor boards, right? Mm-hmm. You have pathologists, oncologists. When I think about an investment committee, I'd love to have kind of a LABI chair there saying, hey, here's what we think about, here's how we're missing, here's what we're looking at, here's what we might not know about that sits and integrates in that process. So starting with the data, then the insights, and finally into the actions.
We've put out a little bit of work on what we're doing with LABI and why we think it's so important to use these decision-making tools to our advantage as we're trying to evaluate the landscape in biotech. And as an investor, as someone that's done many diligences and has done the same thing over and over and over again, how big is the market? Do patients care about this? How much will this be worth? Are there other papers in clinical trials doing this type of work? I've always been so confused as to why, as investors, we want companies to integrate AI and tooling into their decision making, but kind of have failed to do that ourselves. And so I'd love to hear a little bit maybe about your backstory, and how you got to this.
Yeah, no, of course. I will start way back when. So I guess 20 some odd years ago, if you would have met me, you would have met this chubby little Indian kid in Tennessee who would have told you all he wants to be in life is be a doctor. Family of doctors, was super interested, grew up watching Scrubs and House, and was like, this is cool, I want to solve puzzles all day. Went to college, was getting ready to go to med school, and kind of had an unfortunate experience that I think actually a lot of people who end up going into healthcare research do is, lost a very, very close family member to a rare form of cancer. And, that experience truly kind of opened my eyes to the other side of healthcare, which is, at the end of the day, the physicians, no matter how great they are, can only do what they can with the tools they have, right? And when you don't know that much about cancer, when you have a limited supply of drugs that could work, right, there's not that much you could do. And that leads to patients, families, so many people suffering. And I think, was really, really privileged that while I was going through this kind of thought process, had a mentor who kind of saw my love for math, saw my love for bio, and got me involved in kind of DoD's first RNA sequencing project on prostate cancer. And I was like, there might be a way to combine those two. And I think from that moment onwards, I really fell in love with this intersection of how do you take really, really interesting biology and use really, really interesting math and computer science to try and make some sense of it. Right? I think of biology as kind of like one of the last great unexplored frontiers, right? You take space, under the sea, and then biology. And I think we're now at a place where we're building tools and allowing us to answer and probe that in a way that we previously couldn't. And it's also really cool to work in a business where, like, when I actually solve a puzzle, it can hopefully help someone live a better life. So yeah, that's kind of been the genesis story. Right? Got an amazing chance to work with an amazing group of researchers at Cornell, start a company, kind of see the world from the startup side, the big company side, the venture side, and yeah, really thrilled to be at Luma. And because I think from the first moment meeting kind of you and Jamie was energized by the idea of doing things a little bit differently, both in terms of how Luma is being built, but also in terms of how LABI is being fully integrated, which is, we can talk a little bit more about that. Something I'm surprised hasn't been done sooner.
Yeah, I think it's the envy we have to the rest sometimes of the financial world, right? They have this amazing tool called Bloomberg, and it gives you this terminal, which is really an intelligence platform that's able to bring in a lot of rich data sets and insights that people can use to kind of form their own opinions and decide on what to do with that data. And obviously, sort of everyone has the same data, but people are making different decisions with it. Yeah. And so, that's what we always thought we kind of wanted at Luma, which is like, instead of having a Bloomberg screen or terminal up, everyone has a LABI portal up where they're able to interface with and do their work.
It's crazy, as you mentioned, like we're investing in companies that truly are doing best-in-class technology, right? Completely new ways of engineering cells, new AI tools, combine them together, but a lot of the times when we think about how we make the decisions, it's gut feelings, it's whatever you happen to read that day, if you have 2 hours of research versus 1. And I think not only does that probably mean there's a lot of science out there that could be really amazing that's just going unnoticed, it's causing us to make decisions in non-structured ways. And you mentioned, right, like one thing Bloomberg and the terminal was great at is now every financial analyst in the world wakes up, starts the day looking at the same data. They don't have to worry if that data is incorrect. They don't have to worry if there's a missing piece. Obviously they still have to synthesize it all into an insight, but at the very least, they go and they start their day and they start their terminal with everything that they need in front of them. Well, most of what they need. I guess nowadays that's expanding. But as biologists and as biotech investors, we just don't have that, right? It's reading papers online, it's emailing people, it's emailing being like, hey, I saw you have this PDF, can I get the raw data from it, or grabbing things from Dex. And I think at least the very baseline intermediate goal for LABI is like, we want to break through that. We want to create a system where we do have a terminal, a standardized process, we have the data in front of us and can trust that it's not only accurate and reliable, but it's complete and robust.
Yeah. When Jamie and I started this project, we were like, there has to be a better tool than us buying 15 subscriptions. How do you get the data structured, right? Like clinical data from clinicaltrials.gov is structured very differently than a FASTQ file that someone's put on the NCBI portal with sequencing data. And so, like, walk us through that. Like, how are you how have you embarked on this mission? You've been working really hard at this for your life, but really for the last half year at Luma. Like, tell me more about that journey.
So, to your question of how do we do it, right? I wish there was a simple, quick answer. The honest answer is there's not a solution out there in biotech, right? Like, companies and processes, people have struggled through this for years, and as much as I would love to say there's some standardized format, there truly isn't. And I think what we're really focused on right now is how do we quickly and efficiently bridge that gap. So the way we're thinking about it is building on the back end our own data structure, right? Our own network of data points and databases that connect how we see the world, right? And I say how we see the world because I'll be transparent, right? Someone at another company or someone in another approach might see the structures of data differently, but we are taking a very biology-centric view, right? As biologists, we're used to seeing data in networks. We're used to seeing this gene interacts with this gene. This organ has this, interacts with this organ. This pathway has this sets of genes in it. So taking kind of a similar mindset of, hey, if we think about that world in that structured way, why don't we think about our data in the same way? So with that in mind, building that underlying data structure and then using tools to fill that in with data from the ether of the internet and in the source, right? So we take data from clinicaltrials.gov, say how, at its core, what is this data saying, right? It's referencing a clinical trial. A clinical trial is referencing a drug is referencing a target, patient population, et cetera. Let's map that underlying structure. And then on top of that underlying structure, we can add more data sets. So you're completely right. A FASTQ file or RNA sequencing file may not have any similarities with a clinical trial text dump, but the RNA sequencing file might reference a cell type, right? That cell type might reference an underlying patient population. You can link those. So you can say, hey, with this clinical trial that connects to ovarian cancer, ovarian cancer has these cell lines. Here's some data on those cell lines. Or ovarian cancer is being treated with drug A. Here is a perturbation data set of drug A. So you're slowly building this massive web of connections, and each node in that web has data assigned to it. It has data of different types. It has data of different sources. And once you build that, then you can start to traverse it. So the crazy thing is no one's even built that web yet, right? So everyone right now is saying, I'm going to look at my FASTQ data set. And usually there's a team that does it. And that team will create some plots, send it in a Slack message to the clinical team. The clinical team will look at those plots, send a Slack message back to the translational team, right? So our initial thinking is, let's automate as much as we can. If we can build that underlying network, build that underlying web, it allows us to then layer on those different data types. It allows us to think about normalization, not in a forceful way of we have to make every single data set be the exact same, because that'll never happen, and honestly, you'd lose a lot. We can think about it as what is the most way we can represent that data. So maybe, like I said, it's perturbation data gets represented in one way, clinical data gets represented in another, but we map that this is clinical data, this is perturbation data, and here's how they connect to one another.
Yeah. You know, that's so interesting. You even taking a step back, when we think about the integration of AI tools in our investment processes, there's so many ways we could do that, right? That could be summarizing notes during a call or an internal team meeting. It could be generating deal memos from templates that we have. A lot of tools out there exist for some of these tasks. You know, I think today, we've seen some of the latest breakthroughs with Gemini, and by the time this podcast airs, I'm sure GPT will be on to number 12, and Gemini will be on to number 15.
Yeah.
Why not just keep using those tools? Yeah. Like, what are we getting to do here? Yeah. This is a leading question, obviously, for the audience, that makes building LABI purpose-built for biotech so special and different.
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think it really hits at the point of, over the last couple of years, right, the terms AI and LLMs have kind of been conflated to be the same thing, right? And I think it makes sense. ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude have done amazing things, and honestly, the world now looks very different than it did a couple of years ago. But what's important to think through is like these LLM tools, and any tools, right, like they are built for certain things, right? LLM tools are traditionally, and have done the best effort, on text data. And what they're really, really good at is guessing what a human would say next, right? A lot of people call it, like it's what is the next word, what is the next token going to be? That's really powerful for things like summarizing notes or getting meeting summaries, because it's very good at saying, hey, here's a bunch of text or voice to text notes, let's condense them, right? It's good at interpreting them. But the reason it's so good at that is it has this backbone of the entire internet. It knows, it's learned what text means. It learns how people talk about text. It's got Reddit posts. It's got, New York Times articles. It's got cooking recipes that tell you other things. We don't have that for biotech, right? Even if you think about just, simply, right? Like even our biggest source of text, papers, right? People are just reading abstracts into LLMs, right? We don't have that underlying nature. So it's almost like trying to expect those LLMs to work on biotech without any sort of structuring is almost like, hey, I want to do a Google search, but I'm not going to tell Google what's on the internet. It's just got to search on its own. What we really want to do is we've got to take a step back and say, hey, what is the reason this problem isn't being solved? And the reason this problem isn't being solved, this problem being something called multi-hop reasoning, which is how do you make multi-step level connections, is because we have not modeled to the LLM how it should think about the process. Right now, an LLM sees a bunch of text and says, I'm going to view this as one, but it's not able to make those connections that we talked about, that an ovarian cancer drug is hitting this gene, and this gene is modulated in this way, and this gene is hit by this other drug, right? It doesn't have that underlying knowledge. It doesn't have those underlying connections. Our goal is, hey, as LLMs continue to improve, right, as Gemini 5, 6, 7, 8 continues to improve, we're going to leverage those. We're going to be building the underlying infrastructure, the underlying foundation that we can apply tools like that on top of. And maybe they work a lot better. I think right now we're at a place in bio and AI where no one knows because no one's done that work to build it. And we see at LABI kind of a clear path that being able to do that brings us forward, and it goes along, it changes us from just efficiency gains tools which sit in the sunlight into a real tool that could sit within our reasoning engine and honestly could improve as our reasoning engine improves, right? Every new note, every new diligence call, every new deck we get, every new insight, right? Tomorrow, we change our mind and say, hey, we think about the field differently. That information could live inside this data network, could live inside LABI that evolves as the firm grows.
As investors, we're tasked when we see a pitch or a new scientific breakthrough to understand and contextualize it in the broader schema of what's happening, right? Will this hit a target more specifically with higher potency? Will this hit the target and then translate to lower toxicity because of that specificity? So we're wrangling with all the biology and chemistry questions. When we're wrangling with a lot of other data points. Can this thing even be manufactured?
Yeah.
Can it be supplied to the bedside of patients in a cost-effective manner?
Yeah.
And then we're wrangling with, well, I'm going to make this investment today, and here's a dozen other companies, going after the similar target space with similar ideas, and therefore none of our investments ever are static. They're very dynamic, actually, because the field is changing, and therefore sometimes management teams and companies also need to think about their approaches. And so I think one of the things that I've always found is missed in this diligence process we do is a way to continue to re-underwrite or follow on with investments. And it'd be great to have a tool that kind of does that thinking for me, right? As we're getting board material, updates from the industry, new publications and abstracts in conferences. How can LABI help me there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think I completely agree. I think it's, people always say a right investor isn't just someone who writes you a check and backs away, right? Like you want, and I think what we at Luma are really focused on is like being there throughout the duration of the company, right? Supporting the management team, thinking about re-underwriting, et cetera. So we need an intelligence process that evolves as we evolve. Companies will evolve, especially in bio where things change every day. Things fail. You've got to readjust, make new experiments. So, let me take a step. At its core, what LABI is doing in an ideal world is mapping the ecosystem, right? And imagine you do this from day one of diligence, right? You say, hey, I'm looking at a company that's hitting X target. Show me every other company that's hit X target, either directly or indirectly, their effects, and companies that are developing X target, right? With that, you make an insight or an assumption saying, hey, based on this, we think that there's low competition, or this is a high unmet need, and we think this approach could work. Progress it. But, that network evolves. Maybe tomorrow, a year after we invest, Pfizer publishes a data set of a drug that hits that company. If you think about this global network, you're suddenly adding a node, adding an edge. You're saying Pfizer now has a drug, that drug is connected to this target, it does maybe some good things, maybe some bad things. That could change how we think about the world, right? And I mean that not only in the sense of re-underwriting, maybe we're more or less excited about it, but that could be information we could give to the company to say, hey, this is not, maybe it's not even in the same indication, it's a different indication, or it's a different modality. It's like, we can tell them, this is information that you guys should be paying attention to, because in our end, it's changing how we would look at the landscape. And I think that's the most important thing you can do for an investor, for a company, to say, hey, if we were making this investment today, here's new data we'd look at, so you guys should be thinking about the same data. So as LABI evolves, we can kind of ingest that. But also because we're ingesting the data in a real-time setting, data's not static, right? We can go back and say, hey, what did data look like 6 months ago? What did data look like 3 months ago? What does data might look like 6 months from now? And allow us to think about data provenance in a very different way as well. So, I get really excited about a world when we can say, 2 years ago, this as well, right? A lot of times we look in the past and we say, hey, X company was acquired when it was in phase 2 because of blah, 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 right? Imagine how powerful it could be if we could really go into the past, if we had LABI running for 5-10 years and say, like, what did exactly the world look like? Hey, maybe they were acquired because independently company C was doing something that we didn't think about, right? So we can track those changes and see, would that acquisition still happen today? Would it not? And I think that's important. Maybe we made an investment thinking that acquisition was likely, but 2 years from now, we're now saying in today's environment, maybe that's more likely, maybe it's less likely. And it changes how we think about investments, changes how we think about science, and ultimately allows us to be better investors, but our companies, our port companies, to make better decisions. So I think that's what really excites me about LABI, is it's a constantly growing network in an automated fashion, right? It's not someone plugging in data, it's ingesting clinical trials every day, it's ingesting, press releases, it's ingesting patents, right? Constantly learning, constantly growing, and allowing us to track how those changes affect us and affect the landscape. I'm curious, how are you guys on the investment team actually thinking about this? Like, how are you doing this on a day-to-day basis?
That's a great question, because there's not enough manpower in the world to actually be able to do what you're saying, I think, at the personnel level, or at least not for Luma today, and I frankly don't think that's our future either in making those decisions, because I think a lot of the things you said, computers are better at, because they're better at retaining and bringing information and synthesizing some type of outcome. And it's actually our job as investors to assign weights in our minds to those things. And eventually the computer is going to start assigning weights based on how we're assigning weights. But that's kind of what we're doing right today as investors. And obviously the data is important, the reproducibility is important, the markets are important. But when you speak to an entrepreneur, when you speak to a team, there's also a sense of humanity, right, behind their grit, their tenacity, their can-do attitude, their leadership qualities, and those are things I think we can still, hopefully, impact a lot when we're adding to our decision making. But today, as an investor, we have to do it all, and that's really, really challenging.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love what you said about, investors doing different parts and computers being different parts. I think we hear a lot of talk in the world about computers or AI replacing certain high school professions. And maybe we'll get there in the future, but we're certainly not there now. Anyone who talks to an LLM, it's like it's smart, but it's certainly not a person. And I think this is what's really important and really exciting about LABI, is it's not LABI replacing investors or LABI replacing its associates. It's allowing LABI to do what computers are really, really good at: processing, structuring, presenting data, and allowing you guys to do what you're really good at, which is assigning those weights. And over time, we'll get there to add some more of that. But assigning those weights, focusing on the management team, doing things like that. Because I'm curious, right? Like, you said it, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more. Like, when you make a decision, like, how much of it is, I'd say, non-mathematical, numerical? How much of it is just you have to get to know, you have to really understand the team, the people, and the science? Yeah,
I think a really big part of it, right? I think learning about the team is a really big part of it. But often we're doing a lot of that work because we believe in the science already, right? It's table stakes that the science has to be first rate. The company is going after something non-incremental that can change the world if it becomes a standard of care or it becomes the right type of diagnostic or medical device. And so obviously that is very important, but we just like to get to the point where we get to know the entrepreneurs a bit better than still trying to understand their science and poke holes in the theses. And I think there's two instances where this became really profound for me. One, when we were talking to a company we were going to make an investment in, we kind of showed them that we use this tool. It's an oncology company. And we showed them why we thought what we thought about what they were doing. And when we showed them this data, they were like, how can I get access to that tool? Because I don't want to pay a bunch of consultants or some regulatory person for the same information that I'm able to get at the platform level. Or when we're thinking, hey, there's a really big challenge in certain type of diseases, what are the white space opportunities? Just even mapping all that out, it takes a lot of time. And if you have dozens of people that are experts in the space, perhaps it takes a little bit less time, but even those experts I talk to, like, their information gets outdated because no one has full coverage. And so for us and our investors, it's a great tool for them to be able to use to see what's going on. And for our portfolio companies, it's a great tool to be using because it's like competitive intelligence for free that we give them based on our decision making. So Neel, this is quite the undertaking for a pretty small team. And I know you've got some pretty interesting partnerships cooking because we cannot go on this road alone. And so maybe, can you tell the audience a little bit about how we are not alone in this journey and how there's many, many people, I think, that are going to come to be by our side in building this?
Yeah, no, we are privileged and lucky that for solving hard problems, other people are interested and also want these problems solved, right? And maybe even taking a step back, right? Like this is a hard problem. This is not a problem that you can solve with ChatGPT in an afternoon, right? Like it's a fundamental rethinking of how we think about data and networks, and it's an undertaking, but we're willing to do the work, and huge opportunity if we do it right, and huge opportunity not just for us as investors, but we think for the ecosystem, right? We've been talking to I named some pharma companies who are thinking about how can they think about portfolio management, what to acquire, what to not, especially with the rise of Chinese biotech work. Like how do you think about data in a completely novel way? But on top of that, we're also talking to some amazing, amazing technology partners, like some of the largest technology companies who are struggling with the same sort of questions about LLMs that we're struggling about, which is namely like, how do you think about multi-hop reasoning? And I think we mentioned this earlier, but just a little bit of an aside, right? At its core, multi-hop reasoning is how do you think multiple steps forward, right? So if you're a chess player, how do you not think the next move, but think 5, 6 moves in the future? LLMs, really, really good at thinking about the next move, maybe even 2 moves in the future. But if you've ever seen an LLM play chess, they're not that good, right? Because it's not good at thinking multiple steps in the future. And at biotech, we spend our lives trying to think multiple steps. It's, I don't want to say it's easy, but if someone said, if this clinical trial fails, what does that mean? A lot of people could be like, all right, this is good, this is bad. But the harder question is, if this clinical trial fails, what does that mean for this company developing this drug in a completely different indication that has this partnership? LLM's really bad at that. LABI, we're trying to build the infrastructure that does this. And what excites us is some of these technology partners, they're thinking about the same questions in other areas, right? They're struggling with how does that mean for energy? How does that work for deep complex systems, material science, et cetera. What they're excited about is, biologists, we're already used to thinking that way. So while this is an unanswered question in all sectors, we almost have been answering and thinking this way for 100+ years, just the way biologists think. So there's a world in which we can apply our non-AI computational thinking into that, and that allows some really great technology partners and also some really great academic partners, right? Large national labs who are interested in this question. There's really amazing opportunities for us to partner with them. And it allows us to kind of supercharge our work, right? You're right, we've got an amazing team here, but it's a small team, right? We're not 1,000 engineers sitting and coding this. But it allows us to focus on what we're good at, which is injecting biological basis, biological understanding, biological weights, and creating a data system. It allows us to work with technology partners who are really good at what they're at, which is building software, building pipelines, something reusable that we can use, and other technology partners to do what they're great, which is high throughput compute, data access, et cetera. So we're really thinking about, just like we want our companies to leverage partnerships in the right way, like how can we do those same things to leverage partnerships to allow us to build quicker? Because like I said, this is something the industry doesn't have, and I wish I could snap my fingers and have it be done today. And we don't want to wait 10 years and say, hey, we've built this. We want to say like, hey, let's build some momentum, let's show activity in a shorter time scale, and being able to work with partners across the biotech, pharma, and deep tech ecosystem, I think is allowing us to do that at a much faster rate.
You hit the nail on the head when you said, we have to build this because there's nothing else like it. And I wish there was, because then I'd have a Bloomberg terminal I could go to, and my life as an associate or a principal or any investor would be much easier. But there doesn't. It doesn't exist today, and so we feel that it's imperative that we build this for outsized returns and outsized impact when it comes to investing in companies and people to bring a lot of these life-changing medicines to the bedside.
Yeah, no, I would also love it. I just throw money at the problem to be solved, but that's just not the way we are now, we are, right? And I think,
and you saw this firsthand because we ran a test. within Luma, right? Where it was the LABI team and the LABI software versus all of us, basically, in conducting many diligences, but one of them which ended up becoming an investment. And so, do you want to maybe just touch on that internal experiment we ran?
It was really interesting because for everyone listening, right? There's always a risk of drinking your own Kool-Aid, being like, hey, we think this is needed, it's important, but it doesn't actually work. And we wanted just like we ask our companies to be like, show your data, get milestones, like we wanted to do the same thing. So we did this really interesting experiment where, we had two side-by-side diligences. One, the traditional way, reading all the papers, trying to find as much information we can. But in every case, we kind of annotated what information we were basing our decision on, what information we had looked at. In parallel, we had LABI, which had already managed to kind of build this data structure and data network for a given indication, say, you do the same thing, right? Here's what we're interested in, here's what we're looking at, show me the relevant pieces of data. Bring those in front, right? We still doing the weighting, we're still doing the synthesis. So LABI is not saying, hey, invest or not invest, but LABI is saying, here's everything you need to know that we think is going to be relevant to your investment. One truly amazing thing was we found that even across a short period of time, LABI had almost 400% more coverage in certain fields, 800% in other fields, right? So we are seeing more of the world, that.
And how were you doing that? Like, what were we missing in that process that LABI was just able to catch?
Yeah, I think it's just it's these technical connections, right? You think about it this way, right? If you're doing a Google search, and let's say, we're filming this shortly after Black Friday. Let's say you wanted to buy a new trench coat, right? You do it, you probably look at the first page of Google results, right? No one's going to page 8, 9, 10, 15. Maybe there's an amazing deal hidden on page 15 in the Google page, but it's unreasonable and frankly probably wasteful to do that. But that's what we're doing at scale, right? When we're looking at a biotech data set, right? We're looking at clinical trials. You're looking at the top clinical trials, just because you don't fundamentally have time to look at everything, right? And unless you have a 1,000+ person team. But a computer doesn't care, right? A computer is able to look at every single clinical trial where this target or this indication is mentioned, bring them together. Every single trial where related indications matter. Maybe it's in a different language. Maybe it's an outdated result. Maybe it's not even on clinicaltrials.gov. It's got on some random press release somewhere, right? That's what computers are great at, crawling through and basically saying, let me find every piece of this information and bring it all together. Once it's all together, it can then give you that summary and say, hey, I know you found 10 clinical trials. There's 80 that you missed. Maybe of those 80, only 20 are relevant. But those are still 20 new data points you can use to make a decision. Or maybe, truly, that one clinical trial hidden in the rough is in that 80. So that's what really LABI is focused on, is it allows us to kind of crawl that universe of data, structure it in a way that makes sense, and bring it forward in that setting. Not to speak, I think that enhanced coverage, in my opinion, was probably crucial, that led us to make that decision, to make that investment, because it showed us that there was a real path here, and it let us act with confidence because we knew we weren't missing anything.
Yeah. How much innovation does LABI or your team do on the LLM side of this problem that's very special to biotech when it comes to different things, right?
Yeah.
Like evaluating all of the preclinical models one could use in preclinical testing of a cancer drug or an autoimmune drug versus all the clinical trials that were published in inflammation area. Like, those are very different things. And you're dealing with very different data. But I want one platform to give me all the right answers. And if anyone in the audience goes on to OpenAI and asks some super elementary biology questions based on reasoning, it doesn't give you the greatest answers often until you train it and coerce it to kind of getting you closer. How do you do that?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. And you're right. We've done these tests where we go in OpenAI and ask a general question, and it gives you kind of a meh answer. And if you very heavily prompt it, being like, remember to include A, B, and C things, remember to do this, sure. But like, if you already know enough to prompt it that way, you probably already know the answer. And it's funny, you see all these posts about if you give OpenAI the super detailed prompt. But I'm like, if I knew that super detailed prompt, I probably wouldn't need this. So we're using LLMs and innovation in a couple of different ways. So at its core, LABI, we talk about one platform, but it's not one algorithm. It's an agentic system. So what that means is we have different algorithms, different processes all talking to each other. So at the end of the day, even though you're looking at one terminal, there's probably thousands of different agents going and doing things. So you have one agent that's specifically focused on clinical trials. And so what that means is we've taken LLMs and basically fine-tuned them to say, hey, when you look at a clinical trial, here's what this means. When you see enrollment criteria, that's what this means. When you see biomarker, that's what this means. When you see ovarian cancer or cancer of this ovary, those are maybe the same thing. So we're doing that and we're teaching agents to say, hey, process these in a certain way and structure them how we not want. Right, so there's thousands of those that are being built, right, across different data types, different data sources, different data structures, and we're leveraging not just one LLM provider, but all of them to kind of use that foundation that we build the final ones on top of. And on the back half is once that is built, we're doing innovation on how do you even teach an LLM to look at that, right? There's a huge unanswered question in the field of, let's say I snapped your fingers, we had a data set that was purely structured, fully structured out biology, the perfect Bloomberg terminal. We still don't know if an LLM can use that in the right way. LLMs just haven't been trained on that information. They haven't been taught to process in that multi-op context. So also working on that end and working with some, like I said, some amazing technology partners to think about how do you build models that are actually able to reason over these networks? Is it you have thousands of LLMs talking to each other along the edge? Do you have one major LLM? I think that's an unanswered question, but we're doing some work with some partners to say, if we bring that data, if we bring the structure, if we bring that reasoning, we work with you guys who are innovating on the LLM side, we're innovating on the LLM side as well to kind of answer those big questions. And I think, that's what we're going to see over the next couple of years is that's what's going to unlock those like completely novel insights for us. It's going to allow us to say, hey, not only do we have that Bloomberg terminal in front of us with all the biotech data, but we also are finding things you would have missed. We're not just saying, we talked about that early example, we saw more of the world. How amazing would it be if we saw more of the world? We say, hey, we're making this decision, and it pings us like, hey, you guys, like, most people would have missed this, but there's this data set over here. Like, there is actually that one data set in the 90 on Google page 15 that's really interesting. So that's kind of what we're building. So we're innovating on those two ends. And I would say it's not just LLMs, it's actually across the range of AI methods, from LLMs to kind of graph-based, network-based reasoning, more traditional deep learning methods. I would say, we're far more interested in solving the problem versus just, throwing it into an LLM box.
And two takeaways for me from everything you just said is, one, biology surely cannot be the only place you can apply a tool like this. What are the other areas you could apply? And two, private market investments are also not the only place you could apply a tool like this. I'd love to get kind of your thoughts on, as an industry, and maybe you can define web of thought, multi-hop reasoning a bit more compared to the traditional linear reasoning and LLMs. And then two, even in the healthcare and biotech ecosystem, where are other places that you could see LABI or users of LABI having a lot of impact?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and this is what I love to think about. In the future as it grows, like what does the world look like? So, to your second piece first, right? Like, what is web of thought for chain of thought? It's kind of like this initial idea of how do you teach an LLM or any sort of AI method, not just an LLM, to think multiple steps forward, right? And think about connections in an interesting way. We're filming this in New York, and I always like to give the example of, if I just gave you a list of subway stations and said, go find your way around New York, you'd be like, what are you doing, Neil? Like, this is completely useless to me, right? If I gave you a list of subway trains and said, hey, 6 goes A, B, C, D, which is kind of what LLMs do, you'd kind of be like, more useful, but still kind of useless. Like, you want me to take these like 15 lists of this goes to here and like somehow map my way around it? No, what you need is a subway map, right? You need the 6 goes here, and then the L goes here, and then the AC go here, and that's how I get from Times Square to the Lower East Side. That's what we're building, right? That's at its core the difference between web of thought and multi-op reasoning and what traditional LLMs are doing. We want to build a process that allows us to think in those deep domain connections. And there are so many ways that could be useful, right? And bio, of course, right? What if this trial fails? What does that mean for this? And we saw examples of it recently, right? Like, I think in the last couple of years, right? The movement in GLPs, right? Who would have thought 5 years ago that this weight loss drug would have such a profound impact on the industry, right? We've seen impacts in diabetes, we've seen impacts in changing how people are eating, health insurance, et cetera, right? There's this rippling network of connections that, unless you were maybe spending every single waking moment of your day thinking about it, you probably would have missed. And that's one example, but there's so many more, right? So we are trying to map those deep connections. And I'll talk a little bit before going into other fields, right? We talk a little about public versus private markets, right? The public markets and just the world in general is, in the bio, it's so much more than just private industries, right? I use the GLP-1 example, but imagine if you could do that for every big pharma company that's releasing a drug, and you could say, hey, what if this drug works? What other effects could it have?
Yeah.
What could that, if Pfizer's drug succeeds, what that could mean for Novo or AbbVie or Lilly? What if it fails? What if both succeed? We could start to understand those connections, and almost, I laugh at the idea, but it's almost like we're thinking about a future with some of this, the approach we've seen in quantitative finance, maybe we're building towards a world where that could be actually applied to biology in a way that it never has been before, right? Even the biggest public market funds are roughly still doing things the same way, just at a bigger scale, right? This could be an entirely new way of thinking about those markets and that data that previously hasn't been possible. Now, Themasap always we always talk about what about beyond bio? What about healthcare, right? The same decisions we as investors or drug developers are making, the healthcare institutions are thinking about the same thing, right? If you're a hospital, what clinical trials do you run? If you're an insurance company, how do you think about reimbursement? If you're a government, right, how do you think about policy in this? We are working in our small slice of the world, which is biotech, right? But well, actually, I'd be curious about you've been speaking to people across beyond just bio. How are they thinking about it? Because from my understanding, I imagine a tool like this could help them make their decisions better as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of them also want purpose-built and context-situated tools, right? Because if you're an insurance company handling claims, leveraging some of these AI tools, it's much different than if you're a center of excellence trying to enroll a patient cohort for a certain type of ailment. And figuring out your strategy there has to be different in the data you frankly feed into it, right? And so I think when you build a lot of these models, it's more that the data has to inform the model you're building or using, not the other way around, where you kind of take the models and you just slap it on all the different data sets, which is for us why at Luma it's so important to build our own models or at least innovate right on the LLMs, because again, looking at images of immunohistochemistry is much different than looking at enrollment criteria in clinical trials. But I want one tool where I can go start to finish on a diligence. And I think we're hearing this obviously from other investors. We're hearing this from a lot of pharmaceutical companies and people we talk to there, and them leveraging their own proprietary data to do things like that. And we're learning this a lot from other people building AI tools in the healthcare and biotech ecosystem. So I think people are starting to really appreciate that it's not a one-size-fits-all. Gemini, even in its infinity form, will not be applicable to the types of problems that a certain organization is trying to solve for, and therefore they're going to need more context-developed tools, the way we're doing for our industry, right?
It hits a key point about why we think about data and LABI is so important, right? If you have a preclinical team, they don't sometimes have the bandwidth to know everything about the clinical, regulatory, commercial landscape, right? As investors, right, even we try and learn as much as we can, but you know about it, and I do, that no one's an expert in all of those areas. And I think that's why we're excited about bringing all the data together, because it allows you to learn quicker, right? It allows a preclinical, brilliant founder to get an insight into, hey, what does this mean for clinical? What does this mean for commercial? What does this mean for regulatory? The same way it allows us to do those same things.
And I think from the founder side, it's a data-driven reason, right? So a founder pitching it to an investor can say, hey, here's my data and what I've realized from this. Now, obviously, those founders with that data will be hopefully users of LABI and therefore Luma portfolio company founder. But I think being able to make arguments using data-driven technology such as LABI is really, really powerful, and it's frankly something I think that's missing from when the pitch is made, right? It often kind of falls back to a physician or a set of physicians' experience with the drug, or a patient advocacy group's relationship with the drug. But often we're missing that data layer of people making the argument for all of the stakeholders, because not all of the stakeholders are in that room when you're pitching to that investor.
Yeah, and it's truly like an interdisciplinary approach, right? You probably have some firms who are going deep and, we're using AI to make all the decisions, and some more traditional firms who are, we're using everything for human. What I like about, and what I'm excited to see how it evolves is the way we're thinking about this is it's kind of hand in hand. And I will say, for anyone ever in the future thinking about building an AI platform, I cannot tell you how cool it is to be building an AI platform 2 feet away from the users of that AI platform in the same room, right? And it allows us, just as someone who's, of course, spent a lot of his life in like AI and biotech, but like it allows me to challenge my assumptions and kind of bring things forward. And I think that's what's really cool is it's not even like a VC firm contracting with the tech company saying build this for us in the silo and then we'll use it. It's we're sitting, right? Like we're sitting in the, it's cool. Like I sit in diligence calls with the team and I'm like, oh, like this is a really interesting thing that they're thinking about that the platform doesn't do yet. Or hey, like if I just change the way, simple things, if I just change how this is visualized, how this is processed, it'll be helpful. So, for anyone out there who ever building an AI product, find your users, sit with them, so valuable.